Okay. בוקר טוב, שבוע טוב, almost פורים שמח. בעזרת השם, we learn today about Rabbenu Nissim of Girona or Gironda. It depends on, I guess, where you are from. It's like Lebov or Libov now on the news. So Rabbenu Nissim of Girona, I wrote in the title, The Last of the Great Rabbis, of the Gdolim of Sfarad, of Spain. Now, obviously, that's a somewhat arguably a title because you can never know. We do not have the greatometer with which to measure the greatness of different rabbis. And as I would say in just a few minutes, Rabbenu Nissim had some very important students that one can argue that they were also Gdolim. But we may say, without judging the people themselves and their greatness, which again, I have no access to, but just looking at the footprint of Rabbenu Nissim, I think that we can say certainly that he is the last of the Gdolim of Spain, and that is, albeit that he lived through the most of the 14th century. He was born, I saw different dates being given because, as I said many times, no one knows when the Gadol is being born. They just know when he dies. So the dates span between, for his birth, they are somewhere between 1290 to 1315, which is a great difference, but we just don't know. We just don't know. As a matter of fact, Rabbenu Nissim was a very humble person, and there is very little of his historical background seeping through his writings. He wrote a lot. We have a lot of writings from him, but at least to my knowledge and to the extent that I saw in the history that was written about him, it's very rarely they quote his own writing. We would have one big exception that we would see in Mirza Hashem during this shiur, but a part of this exception, there is almost nothing of a personal history that the Ran writes. So most of what we know about his history, we know through his closest student. His closest student was, we call him by the acronym, the Rivash. That is Rabbenu Yitzchak Bar Sheshet. Rabbenu Yitzchak Bar Sheshet was also a very important rabbi, very, very important posek, but he, again, I don't want to judge who was greater than whom, but the Rivash himself, I think, as we would see again in a minute, would admit that the Ran was in a different league. And more than that, the Rivash didn't end his life in Spain. That is because we all know that in 1492, there was the great expulsion of the Jews from Spain. What is less known is that in 1391, there were what we would call pogroms. They wouldn't call it pogroms in Spain, but they were as pogroms as you can have in Spain, and big communities were completely destroyed. It is less known because, just to compare, now many people surface all the witnesses about what was going in Ukraine between the wars, right? And we now hear about it, and in World War I, before World War I. It is less taught in schools and less spoken about for the simple reason that when you have something in the extent of the Holocaust happening in 39, 41 in Ukraine, or 42, no one speaks about what happened in 25. That is just the rule of life, that צרות חדשות משכחות את הישנות, the new troubles making you forget the old ones. And that is also why almost no one speaks about the pogroms in Spain, the me'oraot, right, the events, the terrible events of Spain, the gzeirot of 1391, because we all speak about the whole expulsion, the wholesale expulsion of Jews 100 years later. But truth is that again, I'm speaking I'm now using a very broad brush, and obviously I am overstating, but we can say in a very generalized way that Spanish Jewry had never really recovered from the events of the summer of 1391. And that is why now the Ran was Niftar. I said that he was born somewhere in the beginning of the 40th century, somewhere around, the average is 3000. And he was Niftar, that we do know exactly, in 1376. Okay, so in 1376. So that is 20 years, more give or take, 15 years before the events of, they called it Praot El Kana. Kana is the Hebrew date of 1391 is Kuf Nun Aleph. Kuf Nun Aleph. So they call it Kana, El Kana. And that basically is what caused the demise of Spanish Jewry. So that's the historical framework he's working in. So as I said, most of what we know about him was written by his closest student, Rabbi Yitzchak Bar Sheshet. He himself had to run away in these events that we spoke about that happened 20 years after the death of the Ran. So he had to run away to North Africa. And that is where he is living the last years of his life. But everyone already feels that it is the end of a generation. It's not only of a generation, it is an end of an age. And that is very interesting because just a few weeks ago, we spoke about the Maharam of Rothenburg, who felt the same way in Ashkenaz. And again, it was not yet, he himself would be captured and would end his life in the jail. And his student, the Rosh, should have to run away. You see, it's very interesting. History, Jewish history, unfortunately, is repeating itself again and again. And his closest student, the Rosh, had to run away to Spain, where Jews still had a certain type of a golden age, but they would be expelled from Ashkenaz. And just 100 years later, the Jews would also be expelled from Spain. Okay, so that's again the historical background. So the Rivash, but already the Ran, they feel that they operate as the age, the golden age. Hi. Okay, hi. Okay, so we are speaking about the Ran, Rabbenu Nissim of Girona, who lived in the 40th century. And what we were trying to explain is that he is operating, he knows, he feels that he is in the end of an epoch. And that is a golden age of Torah that opened, we can say in retrospect, it was opened with the Ramban, which we spoke about a lot, that was able to connect the Ashkenazic dialectical learning with the Torah traditions of the west of Spain. So he was able to combine them, and he opened almost 200 years of this more and more advanced and more sophisticated ways of learning. And we can point out how the Ramban has his students, as the Rashba, about whom we spoke last week, the Ra'ah that we mentioned last week. They had their own students, the Ritva, that unfortunately would have to skip, but is another link in this great chain of the Torah tradition of Ramban. And then comes the Ran, Rabbenu Nissim of Girona, who is the end, he is the closer of this chain of great Rabbanim of Spain. Now, who was the Ran? From where did he come? Now, you would have thought that because he's called Rabbi Nissim of Girona, you'd think that he's from Girona. but you would be as right as thinking that if someone is called Krakower, that means that he is from Krakow. There is sometime, someone from his family maybe spoke about Krakow. That is more or less the most you can say. My family name, my last name is Weintraub, which seems to hint that somewhere in my family, people were either dealing with wine or maybe had vineyards, who knows? Or maybe they just lived next to a wine store. No, you cannot know. You cannot know. So he's called Rabbenu Nissim of Girona, but of Girona is like a last name. That is not something, maybe he was born in Girona. I'm not saying that no. I'm just saying that we do not know. We know nothing about his youth because, as I said, he doesn't write about himself. Everything that we have about him is from his student, and his student obviously didn't know him when he was a young boy. He only knew him as an adult. Now, we have several hints to who was the Ren rabbis, because sometimes he would quote someone and he would say, Mori, my teacher. But the problem is that the title Mori, my teacher, does not necessarily mean that you sat by his feet and drank his water, right? It only meant that you learned something from him. So again, there is a certain Rabbeinu Peretz that the Ran mentioned, I think, twice, and says Mori. That is not enough. In some books, they would write, the Ran learned from Rabbenu Peretz. But I mean, other historians, I think they are completely correct in noting that two mentions in a whole corpus cannot teach you that he was his rabbi. There is another place in which he has a certain Mesorah, a certain tradition that he quotes from his father. And he says, Avi Mori. Does that mean that his father was his rabbi? Maybe, I'm sure that his father taught him something. But again, stating so clearly that he was a student of his father, we do not know. We do not know where he was born. We do not know who he learned by. We do know that he saw himself as part of the tradition of Ramban, as we mentioned earlier, meaning this great Torah tradition of learning, of taking the best of Ashkenaz and the best of Spain. Yes, he completely saw himself as continuing this lineage. Not only that, as I mentioned earlier, I think he knew, he saw, he felt, he sensed it. I don't even, he had the Ruach HaKodesh. He put it any way he want. He knew that he is the last one of these Mohicans. Yeah, that's the word. Mm-hmm. And he set as a project, we'll speak about that later, to create a type of a summary of the best that was written and that was taught by this great tradition of the Ramban and his students, and to try and summarize it and make the halachic conclusions, trace the halachic conclusions of what these traditions imply. Okay. Now, just for us to understand the way that the Ran was perceived by his generation, I would quote a tshuva by the Rivash. As I said, Rabbi Yitzhak Bar Sheshet was his closest student, and in a distinct difference from the Ran, he wrote many things about his personal voyages and also about his rabbi. So we use him as a source. Now, obviously, when you use the student as a source about his rabbi, we can all understand that we need to be aware of certain biases, which I think is fair. I mean, it is legitimate for a student maybe to see his rabbi in the best light that is possible. I think not only that it is legitimate, it is maybe expected and even, I would say, required. We, reading now, we should have two hats, right? As historians, we need to be somewhat, we should take it with a grain of salt. As Torah learners, which I hope is the greatest of the two hats, then we can just enjoy I think, the vision of a student which has such a great impact that was given on him by his rabbi. So let's see the first source. As I said, it is from the response of Rabbi Yitzhak Bar Sheshet, the closest student of the Ran. And it's an answer to a certain Rabbi Shlomo Tzarfati, which by his name, again, you can maybe imagine that he's coming from France. but that is just a thinking that everyone that is called Ashkenazi, there is a last name Ashkenazi. These are 99% of the time people that are not Ashkenazim. They were Ashkenazim 500 years ago or something, and someone came from Ashkenaz to North Africa, so they called him Ashkenazi because he was Ashkenazi. Now 4 generations had gone by, and he's still called Ashkenazi, but he is no Ashkenazi anymore. So Rabbi Shlomo Tzarfati may be friends or maybe anyone else. What is important for us is that this Rabbi Shlomo Tzarfati had the courage to disagree with something that the Ran wrote, and we do not have exactly what Rabbi Shlomo wrote, but it seems that it was maybe somewhat sharp. So Rivash, as a good student, is taking the mantle to defend his rabbi. So that's what he writes to this Rabbi Shlomo Tzarfati. Yod'ei dat vadin, hasarim ve'asganim ve'apechavot. I like this line because it is taken, it's a paraphrase from Megillat Esther. Right? Kol Yod'ei dat vadin. That's from the Megillah. So I thought that it would be proper. Nikreu rabbanim. לא מפני עיון הלכה בתוספות ובקיאות במסכת אחת או בשתיים לבד. So he says to this, you think, Mr. Rabbi Shlomo Tzarfati, that by just knowing Gemara and Rashi and Tosfot and having some bkiut in a certain masechta, or maybe you learn 2 tractates, so you think yourself a big rabbi. You should know that where I am coming from, the big rabbis are not people that know 1 or 2 tractates. אבל ששואלים אותם דבר הלכה בכל מקום, ואפילו במסכת דקלה, ואומרים אותה על פה, עם רוב התוספות בכל מה שיהיה תלוי בו דין או פסק. So he says, place I'm coming from, when you ask a gadol, a great rabbi, he can give you the answer. You can ask from, I would use a term that the Riva should not know yet, but from the 4 sections of the Shulchan Aruch. And regardless of where you ask him, he would give you the answer from the Psukim, through the Mishnah, through the Gemara, through the Tosafot. Everything would be inside and Ba'al Peh, by heart. That is the rabbi that I know, he says. ולפניהם יכרעו כל יושבי אוהל ותופסי, it should be תופסי, לא תוספי, ותופסי התורה, יבוא כל בשר להשתחוות. So he says, these were the great rabbis of old. When all the students came before them to submit themselves to these great rabbis. Umin az, but in the time that passed by, חדלו נאספו ממנו בחטאינו, נשאר העולם שומם וגלמוד. But these great rabbis, the Rashba, the Ritva, the Ra'ah, again, I will try to give us some type that we can hold to. I'm sure that all of you had the chance to meet someone from the old country, right? From Europe, but not necessarily, meaning from the time that almost every small city, almost every small Jewish city had a rabbi. It was a serious learner that would write books. Not someone that is a Rav Bet Knesset, as you have here, but I'm joking, but I'm also serious. They were very serious. Sometimes you'd have a community with 30 families, 25 are not even Shomer Shabbat, but the rabbi can be here now. He would immediately become, I don't know, one of the great rabbis of one of the big cities. And in Europe, you had plenty of those. Not necessarily that they were the best in communicating with their communities. That's a different problem. But if we speak now about Torah scholarship, they were top-notch. And there were plentiful of them. And then Holocaust hit, and suddenly people feel that the world is desolated. Because, okay, you can find one rabbi. People coming from Europe to the States. Okay, so there is one Reb Moshe Feinstein. There is one Reb Aaron Kotler. There is one Rabbi Soloveitchik if you happen to be politically so aligned. But that's it. That's it. I mean, walking around in Lita, in Lithuania, you would have, in every street, you would have 4 or 5 like this. I'm exaggerating, obviously, but just to give, I'm trying to give the way that he feels. The Rivash feels that the world is desolated. We used to have all of these great Rabbanim, that you can ask them question in any area of halacha, exotic areas, and they would just begin to give you the sources, Baal Peh. And we do not have these anymore. לולי השם צבקות הותיר לנו שריד, דבר אחד לדור, ומורנו הרב הגדול רבנו ניסים נטרי רחמנה. So Rabbenu Nissim is still alive when this Shuvah is being written. And he says the Rivash, we have only one surviving relic of this old time. And that is Rabbenu Nissim. And you, I want to be careful because I don't know who was Rabbenu Shlomo Tzarfati, but continue with your favorite degradatory term. But you are disagreeing with Rabbenu Nissim. Who do you think you are? Who do you think you are? And היה כאחד מהם לדעת טוב טעם ודעת, בקיא בשלושה סדרים ודמו לי כמנדמנחי בקיסטה. So you know that there are 6 volumes to the Mishnah, to the Shas, right? זרעים, מועד, נשים, נזיקים, קודשים, טהרות. Right? These are the 6 volumes, 6 מי יודע, 6 סדרי משנה. So these are the 6 volumes of the Mishnah and the Talmud on them. Now it's so interesting. It doesn't claim that his rabbi is an expert in all 6 volumes. That was something to the rabbis of that was the Ramban. But he knows, he says, that there are 3 volumes that are relevant in nowadays. Kodshim, unfortunately, sacrifices we do not have. Taharot, we do not have. So, and Zraim, which are mostly the mitzvot of Eretz Israel, there in Spain, it was almost of no use. But there are 3 Sadarim, Nezikim, the damages, and Nashim, that is the whole of marriages and divorces, and Nashim, Nezikim, and Moed, thank you. And thank you very much. And the holidays, so all of these are relevant. So he says all of these are like in his pocket. In his pocket. So the reason I like this tshuva of his, you see that he is honest. He doesn't say, my rabbi knows everything. Yeah, I know people that think that the rabbi knows everything, which is fine. I have no claim against it. But I can see that you can rely on him because he states the truth. He doesn't go overboard. So he says, he's baki בשלושה סדרים, דמו לי כמנדמנחי בקיסטי, ודעתו רחבה מני ים. So here, that may be somewhat hyperbolic. So he says, his mind is wider than the sea. ושכלו זך וישר. His brain, his understanding is straight and is clear. אין ארוך אליו בכל חכמי ישראל. There is no one like him in all the rest of the sages. My rabbi is the greatest, as they say. ואין להשוות כולם לפניו כקליפת השום וכגרגיר הסומסום. He says, every other rabbi, any other rabbi, if you compare him to Rabbi Nissim, he is like the peel of the shum, the peel of the garlic, and like a sumsum, right? A sumsum is a sumsum. Yeah, a sumsum seed, sesame seed. Yeah, sesame seed. ואם דמית היו תהיה כמוהו, you think, Mr. Rabbi Shlomo Tzarfati, that you can be like Rabbenu Nissim? באומרך היה בדעתך יהיה לך כאח ורע? You think you can be his brother? You can think you can be his friend? על כן התיישבת אצל גבולו, so you can sit on his borders, which is again a loaded term nowadays. So you can sit on his borders, הן זאת לא צדקת חוץ מכבודך. So with all due respect, you know that when you begin a sentence with all due respect, there's no respect. So with all due respect, you are incorrect. ואף אם גבהת כגבוה השמיים, even if you think that you are as high as the sky, ישנו גבוה מעל גבוה. Know that there are skies above the skies. Okay, so again, take that with a grain of salt. He's a student of his rabbi. So not necessarily that all the other sages from Israel are like the peel of the garlic and the sesame seed. Fine. But you do not write that about me, right? So we speak here about someone who is having a huge impact. And what is even more important is being seen as a bridge to a world that is disappearing. a world of Torah scholarship, a world of Torah tradition, of learning traditions, which is disappearing. Now, why was this war disappearing in Spain? What was going on? So I'm not an historian. And if you want, you should read very good history books that were written by people that not only that are far expert, they are experts, which I am not. I am just giving you a scoop of what I was able to gather from my readings, and also that correlated with sources I found about the Ran. So that is what I'm trying to give you now. One problem, which we can see in other Jewish communities in other places, in other eras, and that is that as the Jewish community was more and more succeeding materially, the people that were elevated into positions of power were not necessarily the people with the highest moral standards. I am using an under, that is not understood. And Rabbenu Nissim had decided, for reasons that we cannot know, because we have no testimony about that, but we do know that he didn't hold any formal position. If you remember, the Ramban was a formal rabbi by the state, the Spanish state. Again, there was no Spanish, etc. Rashba was a state rabbi. In the time of the Ran thought it would be wiser not to take any formal position. Now, he didn't live in Girona, he lived in Barcelona. I don't know where he was born, as I said earlier. But all the knowledge we know of him, all of his activities that we are aware of, took place in Barcelona. But he was not the formal Rav of Barcelona. He did try to put his hand into communal politics. And as we would say immediately, that not necessarily was so simple. And again, I'm quoting from Shut Rivash, source bet. Ha'adon natri rachmana. So here again, it's the Rivash writing to a certain guy, a certain fellow that was in dispute, in machloket with another Rav. And the Rivash is trying to put the machloket to rest, to try to unite these two people, two rabbis that are in dispute with one another. So together, maybe they would be able to work to enhance the Torah, the position of Torah. Because what is even worse than people that are distant from Torah, that take positions of power, is that while they do that, the good people, the people that are supposed to represent Torah, they are engaged in fighting each other. And that allows the people that Torah is not their primary concern to take this position of power and then to lead the community to wherever they want to lead it. So that is what the Rivash is trying to do. So he says, now he's trying to be as, polite and gentle because he wants to influence. He wants to convince the people that he is writing to, the men that he is writing to, he's trying to convince them to unite. So he doesn't want to alienate them. It's not like the last letter in which he wants to show him who is the boss. Now he wants to gain his trust. So he says to him, Adon Atrachmana, ראיתי דבריך האחרונים, ויהיו בפי כדבש למתוק, אכלתי מהם די. So he says, I read your letter, it's like honey, and I ate enough of it. So you see that he's trying to be gentle, but he's, he's paraphrasing here a passage from Mishlei. If you find honey, eat enough, but not more than enough, lest you may vomit it. So that is what he's rephrasing here. אכלתי מהם די, I ate enough of the honey. וידעתי כל מעשיך לשם שם. Now I know that you are working for the sake of heaven, and that's why you are fighting this other rabbi. Fine, I understand that. ועם כל זה, but knowing all of that, כדי לתת מקום לשלום, אף בראותך מעשים אשר לא יעשו, אשר ראוי לגור בעושים ולהוכיחם. I understand that you see here acts that you think are completely improper. And you think you must be the one to stand against and to rebuke. the evildoers. היה טוב לקרוא לחכם ההוא להיות ידו איתך, להסיר מכשול עוון ולקנא בעושה עוולה. So he says, instead of rebuking the other rabbi, maybe you can join forces with him, and both of you together, you like to rebuke. Just rebuke the people that need to be rebuked. Do not fight each other, which, you know what, we can just take this answer and just hang it over every shul. So he says, instead of fighting each other, let's join forces. ושניכם כאחד טובים, תוכלו להוכיח ולגאול. He says, you can both rebuke anyone together. בבלי נודד כנף. And then he says, וכי נפשי. That's a language of an oath. He says, I take an oath I swear in my life. אני ראיתי בברצלונה את מורנו הרב רבנו ניסים זצ"ל. I saw our teacher. Here, Rabbenu Nissim is passed away. So here is called Zatzal. In the last letter that we saw, it was called Natrei Rahman, Nun Resh. That means God would save him. So that is when he's still alive. When it's written Zatzal, that means that he is the other side of the 120. So he says, ראיתי את הרב רבנו ניסים זצ"ל, כשהיה רוצה להוכיח על איזה דבר מעצמו, when he was trying to rebuke people on something, and he tried to do it by himself, קצת מעשירי הקהל היו מתריסים כנגדו ומבטלים עצתו. So the rich people in the community, the strong people, they would מתריסים כנגדו. I don't know how to translate to English. I think these words that only Hebrew, that only Jewish can understand, Jews can write. So they were, do you remember when Moshe Rabbeinu comes, that is the first scene of Jewish leadership. Moshe Rabbeinu comes, he sees two Hebrews fighting each other. And that is the first time a Jewish leader is trying to lead his community. And he says to them, why would you, that is wicked to eat each other. And the answer is being given is, thank you, Rabbi, for your guide. No. The answer is being given, and I always say, I know what was the hand gesture. The answer is being given is, Mi samcha lesar v'shofet aleinu. Who do you think you are rebuking us? So these two people that were fighting each other, suddenly they join forces against the rabbi, right? Against Moshe Rabbeinu. And exactly the same. Now, again, a very reoccurring theme in Jewish is no chaschim, this shul, but in other places. So the rabbi would come and he would try to rebuke, try to fix some people's ways, and the answer would be, who do you think you are? And the rich people of the community, they would be matrisin kenegdo, they would be speaking against him, umevatlim atzato. Not only, they would dismiss. Mevatlim means dismiss, like bitul chametz, ke'afra de'ara, like the sand of the earth. So they were just dismissive of him. So you'd think that you'd have the Ran here in the shul, and you'd say something. You'd think that people would follow. No, no, they were rich people. Why do they need to listen to the Ran? They know how to make money. He obviously not. So, so the Rivash, and that, as I wanted to say, that may be the reason. Now I'm speculating, but that may be the reason why he didn't want to take any formal position. He didn't want to be dependent on this bunch, and he preferred to be a private citizen and be able to speak his mind. Now they may be dismissive or may be acceptance, but at least he would be free. Maybe. Now that's, as I said, that's a speculation. ואם היה לו, so the Riva says, אם היה לו שם כמה גדולי הקהל קרוביו, בעלי בריתו, אהביו ותלמידיו, וגם בגויים גדול שמו, וכל שכן, he says the Ran, says the Riva, I cannot understand how they could have done it, because he had some students there in the shul, or in the community, and his name was great. Even the non-Jews were admiring the Ran. Now, obviously, that didn't help him among the Jews. But so the Riva says to the man that he's writing to, so you should understand, even the Ran found it difficult to rebuke people. So you who are not yet the Ran, as I said, if you want really to change, if you want to move something, you should join forces. If people want to make some change in a community, then speaking from the pulpit is nice, and it is good maybe sometimes in order to take out, right, the anger, but it does not, it's ventilation. It's very rarely help. What it really can help is that you build coalitions, you speak with people, you convince people, and then you create a grassroots movement that may make a change. Okay, another thing very important that was happening was a worsening external circumstances in Spain. It was not only that the Jewish community, the dynamics in the Jewish community were not necessarily positive, it was also that external situation was worsening. In what ways? So one thing that was, it was a process that was very long, but it was getting worse and worse, was the relationship with the government, with the king. And we all know how it ended. But as of now, it is in the process of worsening. And part of the problem was that the priests were always poisoning the king or the queen, depends, but they were poisoning the court against the Jews. Now, why would the priests want to do it? A, because of ideological reasons. Meaning they believe that we murdered the God. So I guess that, I don't know, it's a strange crime, but if you are to be blamed in it, then you should be punished. The second reason was that they were jealous because the Jews were very successful. And that went against what they were trying to teach, and that is that the Jews are supposed to remain as witnesses for their mistake that they didn't accept, the man, right, Toaish, and that is why they should always be in a very miserable position and condition. But that is not what was going on. What was going on was that the Jews were, on average, better situated than your average Pedro in Spain. So people were, and the priests were not happy with that. And C, they were hoping, as really happened, that if they would be able either to kill the Jews or to Christianize them or to expel, whatever would happen, there is all of this property that would be left. So who would get it? The church is a very good candidate. So they were always poisoning the kings against the Jews. Now, some of the time, the king or the court would oppose that. Why? Because the Jews were needed for international trade and for economics, for bankings. They were providing services that it was very difficult to find without them in the medieval times. But sometimes either the king was not smart enough to understand that he needed Jews, or either that he was, I would say, maybe pious enough that his piety overcame his rationality. When these things happened, we were in big troubles. And on one event, there was a certain sacred object. I can't remember even know what exactly it was. In the churches of the old times, they had very strange things. They would hold as sacred relics. Sometimes it could be, I don't know, a hair from the beard of a certain, very strange things. Now, in one of these churches, these things disappeared. And the Jews were blamed for taking the object. I don't know what he's doing with, burning it, making matzot out, I don't know what. But they were blamed because, obviously the priest of the church didn't want to take the blame for losing this relic. Maybe so, who knows? So again, the Jews were blamed, which is just the regular happenings. And when the Jews are being blamed, then most of the time the people to pay the price would be the leaders of the community. And that is what is happening to the Ran. Again, this is not from the Ran himself, this is from the Rivash. So says the Rivash, זה קרוב ל5 חודשים, קמו אנשים בני בליעל מקרבנו, והעלילו הרב הגדול רבנו ניסים נטרי רחמנה, ו6 נכבדים מן הקהל, ובתוכם החכם דון חסדאי נטרי רחמנה, ואני, ואחי השם ישמרהו, ישמרהו אלוקים. ומסרו אותנו למלכות. So we are jailed by the king. Now, in the answer, it doesn't say why they were being put in jail. The story I just told you is a story we know from the Spanish chronicles, and we assume that the people that were jailed are the people mentioned here in this answer by the Rivash. So the Ran was in jail for 5 months. Now, I think that we all understand that the jail in Spain was not the jail here in Israel or in the United States or in any other Western state. It was a Beit HaSohar, it was a Boras, it was a pit. That was what it was. So for 5 months he was there. ועדיין אנחנו נתונים בערבון הלא חמאס, ישיב להם גמול השם כמעשה ידיהם. So says the Rivash, I hope that God would pay them what they do to us. ומן אז לא מצאתי ידיי ורגליי בבית המדרש, ולא יכלתי להשיב על ספרך. So he says, from there on, obviously I was not in the Beit HaMidrash, so I couldn't answer your question. So these are 5 months, at least, well, we do not know when they were released. So it may have been 5 months, may have been a whole year. Again, we do not know. But at least for 5 months, the Ran was jailed by the authorities. And that is, again, a sign of the deteriorating relationship with the governor. Okay.
So it says that does that mean?
Yeah, it can be Jews. So again, the other version is that is part of what we spoke earlier about, his fight against the rich people of the community. But as I said, there is a support from the Spanish chronicles that people were jailed for this blood libel. It was not blood, but relic libel. So I went with this version, and then Mikir Beinu is not necessarily from the Jews. Maybe it was some type of a combination. Maybe the Christians were looking for someone to blame, and then the enemies of the Ran had put his name forth in the list. The problem is that we have so little knowledge. It's very hard. Again, or maybe I am missing something, but I was trying, when I prepared this show, I was trying to look through what I at least able to access. To the best of my knowledge, the Ran is, if you need something to do about a PhD, then the history of the Ran, the biography of the Ran would be an excellent candidate. To the best of my knowledge, there was nothing yet extensive that was written on the Ran. We have on the Ramban, very good work. We have on the Rashba, very good work. We have on the Rivash, on the students of the Ran, we have a few very good works. But on the Ran, I was not able to find anything extensive, just on the encyclopedias and the like of these. Okay. There was even something that was much worse, maybe, but that was completely unexpected. And that was, if you know your European history of the 40th century, you know that something really terrible happened in the 40th century, and that was the Black Plague. The Black Plague, the Black Death. And that was, I mean, it depends where, because it swept the continent in different times, different places, but it seems that the Ran met it in Spain somewhere between 1347 and 1351. Somewhere there between. Now again, I may be off in a few years, but I don't know, it's not very important, the specific year. Now, I don't think that I need here to speak about the outcome of what is now considered to be an outburst of the bubonic plague, that's the word, in Europe in the 40th century. We know that about 40% of the population of Europe has died. I mean, we speak about a plague nowadays, and just think about 40% of the population of Europe died. All villages were abandoned. And that was obviously that was a great hit. Not only in Europe, also in Asia and in other places, but for us right now, we speak about the history of Jews in Europe. Then now the Jews themselves, their death rate was somewhat lower. Now it's very difficult to separate here between myth and facts. It's very difficult. It seems that the death rate was somewhat lower, and that is contributed. That is not contributed. Attributed, thank you. It's attributed to better hygiene because they were washing their hands and because they would bury their dead as soon as possible. Jews do not delay burial, while in the non-Jews world, it is very customary to delay burial as a sign of respect. But for us, sign of respect is to bury him as soon as possible. And that were very good factors in preventing, not preventing, but at least in limiting the outburst of this plague. The problem was that when the non-Jews saw that the Jews are being less hit by the plague, they came to the, I guess, inevitably, a conclusion that the Jews are poisoning the wells. The whole term of poisoning the wells seems to be born back there. That the plague is being caused by the Jews poisoning the wells. That's why they know not to drink or drink only in the right time, or maybe they have the medicine, or see it as you want, but that's why they are more defended, and that caused very, very strong. I mean, the people that were, anyhow, they were devastated, and they just looked for someone to blame. And they have no knowledge of germs, they have no knowledge of anything, just anything. And they needed someone to blame, they needed something to do, some action that they would feel that they are doing something. And it was very convenient to everyone involved, except of the Jews, to blame the Jews. Always blame the Jews. That's always work. And that's what they did. And that is just another sad episode. And I'm sorry that we are in the week of Purim, and it seems that we are just speaking about certain things, but that's galut for us, right? That's just the way that it was. And it was not very different in Spain. So Jews were hit from both directions, both from the plague itself, even if the death rate was lower. Obviously, let's say the death rate for the Jews is only 25%. It's still 25%. Just, I don't want even to imagine that. And then they were hit from the other side by the pogroms. And here, the Ran could not ignore it anymore. As I said, there is very little history coming through in the Ran's writings, but that is something that he is writing about, and I would like to read it with you, and we would finish with that. So the Ran, just before we read that, I want to say a few words about the literary works of the Rabbenu Nissim of the Ran. So the Ran wrote his most important contribution to Torah, in my eyes at least, but I think not only in my eyes, his most important contribution to Torah literacy is his Peirush on the Rif. Now, if you may recall, the Rif was the very first rabbi that we spoke about. He wrote halachot. He wrote a summary of the halachic conclusions of the Talmud Bavli. So you would take a sugya of the Talmud Bavli, omit the questions and answers, and only write the halachic conclusion. The Ran wrote a running commentary on the Rif. What he did there was brilliant. He was summarizing all the Torah that was written in Ashkenaz, but mostly in Spain. As I said, he saw himself as a Zion, as a child to the tradition of the Ramban and his students. And he was summarizing these are many, many writings. So he took these writings of the Ramban, of the Rashba, of the Ra'ah, of the Ritva, and other rabbis, and he was just giving you the highlights which are important to halacha and what should be the halachic conclusions of this tradition. And by that, he brings to some, I am sure that he didn't see it like that, but for us in retrospect, we can see that he brought to a closure a great move that was opened hundreds of years before him by the Rif, which is on one way it is somewhat sad to see this great tradition being concluded and depart. But on the other hand, it is because it was completed in a sense. This way of learning Gemara came to its conclusion. And yeah, I know I would finish in a few minutes. I will finish in a few minutes. I just thought it's chaval not to say what I see as very important. So that was one work of his, very, very, very important. Other work that is very important is what we call drashot Aran sermons. So these are 12 sermons, very heavy, not very, somewhat heavy on the philosophical side. He was somewhat of an outlier in the sense that he was not Kabbalist in an age and a generation that almost all of his contemporary rabbi friends were Kabbalists. So he was not. Not that he was very much against it, it was not his thing. So he was more into philosophy. And that is what, and he wrote the drashot, 12 sermons, that in which he is trying to learn Torah in a way that is somewhat philosophizing it, but more of that, it is a moral view. He's asking himself, what are the moral conclusions of what we read in the Torah? And in Drasha Yud, he writes the following, and as I said, I do apologize for being late, but we did also start late, so I allow myself. And I think it is important words. Avoteinu, he says, lo ra'u et musar Hashem Elokeinu kmo shera'inu anachnu. He says, our forefathers had never saw the musar, meaning the punishment of God, as we did. בזמנם הייתה הארץ יושבת ושליבה, עולם כמנהגו נוהג, הנגב והשפלה יושב, ועם כל זה היה קוטנם עבה ממותנינו. ואם היו ביניהם קצת אנשים נפתים אחר מנהגו של עולם, לא היה מן התימה. He says, for them the world was very simple and very regular. Things were as they have been, at least from the way that, from his angle, from his point of view, things have been the same for 300 years before him. But now, he says, something has changed. אנחנו ראינו מוסר אלוקינו זה י"ג שנה. So I'm not sure if it means that already for 13 years the plague is being rolling around, or we mean to say that 13 years ago we saw the judgment of God. עד שנשתנו סדרי בראשית, כי ירד בשנה ההיא לרוב יושבי העולם רוע, וחלו בהם חולאים משונים. Since there was some strange disease that was against the nature of the world. We know the world, there are certain diseases, we know how to handle them, or that we do not know, but at least we are familiar with them. But something has changed 13 years ago. And there was certain disease that is outside of what we see as nature. It is not part of the regular way of the world. אי אפשר שנמשכו למנהגו של עולם, אבל כל משכיל צריך להודות ולומר כי אצבע אלוקים היא. So every person that has some mind has to admit that it's the finger of God. כי החולאים הנוהגים בבני אדם, הם קוראים בו מצד טבעו, אבל הזרים אינם נופלים בהם בטבעו, אבל עונש האלוהים והשגחה עליו. He says, if things are as normal, there are diseases that are part of the normalcy of the world. But when you have an outburst of a plague, that's not something that is normal. That is a sign from God. Now, again, he speaks about the Black Death, but I thought that we can, to a degree, also take it to ourselves. Now, I would not read it inside. I would explain it in my own words. And if you want, you can either read it here from the source or maybe open the whole drasha. It's a long drasha. Take a day or two. But I don't think that he gave it in his shul, or otherwise I do somewhat understand these rich people that were opposing him. At least 3 hours to say everything that is written there. But what he says is the following. He says, first he gives the explanation, maybe it's a punishment. He says, no, it cannot be a punishment. Why? Because we see people that do not deserve to be punished, that are being killed, and he goes he rolls around. Then he says he completely rejects the idea that it's a punishment. And then he says, you know what it is? It is away from God. I mean, we have in our nature, he says, we have 2 tendencies that are contradicting. One is going after our mind, after our intellect, after our understanding. And the other is going after our whims, going after our desires. And usually you are supposed to be able to rein in the desires and control yourself by your mind. But when the world is very regular, then slowly we begin to fall after our desires. But as they say, there are no atheists in the foxholes. When things get very bad, you do not think about your desires. When the black plague is hitting the world, then people are not after money because you understand that money is nothing. When, again, I would use it now in our terms, in what we know. I mean, he speaks of something that is much more extreme, but for our purposes, when you see people that are getting married with maybe 10 people, you understand that maybe a hall and the best orchestra and 500 guests is not so important. And the color of the cloth is not as, tablecloths is not as important as you thought it is. So suddenly it gives you a very clear vision of what is important in life and what is not important. Says the Ran, we should relate to this outburst of disease as a wake-up call to ask ourselves what is important and what is only something that we thought is important. But now that we shake, that when you're being shaken, all the dust is being removed. So that is his view of the events. He says we should see it as a wake-up call and ask ourselves what is really important for us. And I do think that is a very useful observation and insight that he can teach us. And by that, we finish with the Ran. Next week, Be'ezrat Hashem, I hope to speak about his student, the Rivash. And that would conclude the Spanish experience for our learning. Thank you so much, and Purim Sameach. Bye-bye.